I want to begin with the part of this story that most people will want to dismiss because it sounds too strange. What if the chaos is not an accident? What if the apparent overreach, the simultaneous fights, the strange obsession with North America, the war in Iran, the talk of Greenland, Venezuela, Mexico, and security perimeters, all of it is part of a single strategic logic that is the argument in the reference document? Not that Trump is impulsive without a pattern, but that he has chosen a pattern so destructive that people mistake it for impulsiveness. That is the framework I want to explore, because if you treat the document seriously, the war in Iran is not the main story. The war in Iran is the trigger. The main story is the controlled demolition of the old order. That is the first point. The document is asking you to imagine that the old American model is already dying anyway. The financial empire, the petrodollar order, the offshore manufacturing base, the multicultural consumer republic, the global policeman architecture, the debt-driven, Wall Street-centered, cheap money system. Under this view, the question is no longer, how do we preserve it? The question becomes, how do we manage its collapse in a way that leaves North America as the strongest surviving fortress? That is what the text is really about. And once you understand that, the ground invasion of Iran stops looking like a mere military gamble. It starts looking like an accelerant. Now let me show you why the invasion question matters so much inside that theory. On the military level, the document is very clear. Invading Iran on the ground would be a nightmare. The terrain is terrible. The mountains favor defense and guerrilla war. The deserts stretch logistics. The distance to Tehran is punishing. America does not have remotely enough troops in theater to conquer and hold the country. And the scale of force required would move from conventional policy discussion into something closer to total national mobilization. The reference insists that even the basic manpower arithmetic already shows the contradiction between the fantasy of easy invasion and the reality of what Iran actually is. Fay file site Fayturn 27 file 0 Fay. That is important because it means one of two things must be true. Either the planners are incompetent on a world historic scale, or the point is not conventional military victory in the way the public imagines it. The document argues for the second. And under that logic, the real function of the war is not to occupy Iran successfully. It is to trigger chain reactions. That is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes central. Because once a ground invasion begins, Iran does not keep the conflict politely contained. It mines, strikes, escalates, and tries to blow the cost outward. The source is explicit that Hormuz is the lever through which Iran can push oil toward $200 a barrel and widen the pain beyond the battlefield. Fay file site Fayturn 27 file 0 Fay. Now, if you stop there, you still miss the larger argument because the document keeps saying the same thing in different forms. The real target is not just Iran. The real target is the old order S infrastructure, oil flows, food flows, fertilizer inputs, semiconductor materials, debt finance, reserve currency demand. That is the system. And this is where the text becomes much more sophisticated than normal war commentary. Most people think Hormuz means expensive gas. The document says think bigger, think fertilizer, think food, think helium and sulfuric acid for semiconductors. Think AI, think the stock market, think the chain between Middle Eastern shipping lanes and American financial mythology. That is why this argument matters. It is not saying war hurts. Everyone knows war hurts. It is saying this specific war. If widened through ground invasion becomes a demolition charge under the supporting beams of the globalized economic order. Fay file site Fayturn 27 file 0 Fay, and then we arrive at the petrodollar. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly enough. The dollar S centrality is not magic. It is supported by structures, and one of the most important structures is the oil order. If Gulf energy no longer flows reliably, or if the Gulf states become too unstable to sustain the same old pricing and security assumptions, then the rest of the world starts recalculating. Japan recalculates, China recalculates, Europe recalculates. The buyers of American debt recalibrate their trust in the system that made those debts manageable. The document takes this logic very seriously and argues that the war could become the event that finally cracks the monetary architecture of the American empire. Fay file site Fayturn 27 file 0 Fay, that is the deepest part of the argument. And now the North America obsession begins to make more sense. If the old order is going to break anyway, then the winning move is not to save its universal form. The winning move is to make sure your continent emerges with the resources to dominate the broken world that follows. That is why the reference keeps circling the same cluster: Canada, Venezuela, Greenland, Mexico, Panama, food, oil, water, minerals, Arctic access, manufacturing, security perimeter. The point is not symbolism. The point is autarkic potential. The point is that North America could become a self-sufficient resource fortress while Europe, Asia, and the Middle East scramble through shortage and disruption. That is the technate vision buried inside the text. And once you name it, the rest of the argument becomes coldly coherent. You do not need to win the old empire. You need to be best positioned after the old empire breaks. That is the second point. The theory is not preservation. It is succession. Now, is that theory morally monstrous? Yes. Is it costly? Yes. Does it sacrifice millions of ordinary people to systemic restructuring? Absolutely. But those facts do not make the logic incoherent. They make it imperial. And that is why the reference compares this kind of thinking to Putin's longer game in Ukraine and to broader Eurasian civilizational theory. The point is not that Trump and Putin are identical. The point is that both can be understood as leaders who looked at a decaying order and concluded that trying to preserve it for everyone was less rational than surviving its collapse better than rivals. Fay file cite Fay-turn 27 file 0 Fay. That is a very dark strategic worldview, but it is not a random one. Now, let us go back to the invasion in itself, because I do not want the abstract theory to hide the concrete horror if America goes in on the ground. The early days may still look superficially familiar: maps, arrows, briefings, claims of rapid progress, but then the material logic takes over. Iran activates decades of preparation. Underground systems emerge. Supply convoys become targets. Helicopters become targets. Fuel becomes a vulnerability. Every mile inward increases the cost of staying alive. The document stresses that Iran has prepared for exactly this scenario for 25 years, and that the real American weakness is not the first blow, but the long war after the first blow. Fay file cite Fay-turn 27 file 0 Fay. That is why the invasion is such a paradox inside the larger theory on the narrow military level. It is catastrophic on the wider systemic level. It may still function as intended if your actual goal is to blow apart the old arrangement fast enough to force a reordering. That is why this is such a disturbing argument. It says failure and strategy may coexist. The invasion can fail militarily and still succeed historically in destroying the old framework. That is the third point. And it is also why ordinary people always get annihilated in transitions like this. Americans who get deployed, Iranians who get bombed, Gulf populations who live under infrastructure risk, workers in poor countries who suddenly face food shortages, families already living on thin margins when oil and fertilizer explode upward. These are not accidental casualties in the argument. They are built into it. The imperial center absorbs pain and still expects to reassemble power afterward. The periphery absorbs pain and often stays shattered. That is how these transformations work. Now, let me be clear about one thing. I am not claiming this interpretation is the only interpretation of Trump-esque behavior. I am saying it is the most structurally interesting interpretation in the document. And once you see it, many seemingly disconnected actions stop looking random. The war in Iran, the obsession with the North American perimeter, the hostility to the old global manager role, the contempt for free-riding allies, the move from finance language toward resources and manufacturing language, the willingness to tolerate systemic breakage if it accelerates reconfiguration. That is a pattern. And if it is the pattern, then the real question is not, can America conquer Iran? The real question is, who emerges strongest from the ruins after this war helps break the old system? That is the adult question the document is asking. And it is a much more frightening question than the television one, because the television question is about military success. The adult question is about civilizational triage. Who eats? Who freezes? Who borrows? Who controls resources? Who becomes dependent? Who becomes the fortress? Who becomes the wasteland? That is the logic. So if you ask me what this reference document is really about, I would put it like this. It is about the possibility that a U.S. ground invasion of Iran is not merely reckless escalation, but part of a darker strategic wager that the old global order is already unsalvageable, and that by accelerating its collapse, North America can be rebuilt as the dominant self, sufficient block in the harsher world that follows. That does not make the wager wise. It does not make it humane. It does not make it likely to unfold exactly as intended, but it does make the apparent chaos more intelligible. And that is why this analysis matters, because if that is even partly the game, then people who still think only in the language of winning the war are misunderstanding what the war is being used to do. It is not only about defeating Iran, it is about detonating a wider order. And once you see that possibility, the question changes completely. You stop asking whether the operation makes sense at the battlefield level. You start asking what kind of world the architects believe they can inherit after the battlefield destroys the system everybody else was still trying to preserve. That is the real danger, not just a failed invasion, a successful demolition.